Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that doesn't even know what day of the week it is anymore. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. Just as you say, carrying on at home. Not 100% sure what day of the week it is, except for the fact it's Pancake Day. That's the only reason I know it's Tuesday as we record, because I have a pancake just off to the side that I didn't manage to finish in our pre-show roundup. So I will make sure to remove any awkward noises I make.
It's okay. I was shocked when my wife informed me that it was Pancake Day today, because I was not aware that any of that was still happening. So much in my own little bubble I am. But yeah, no, it's been refreshing to have. I've also had pancakes today. It's nice. I always have. I don't know if you have this experience. I want to eat all the pancakes, get to my third pancake, and then absolutely just stop. My body shuts down and says, no more pancakes for you. And then I just regret my life choices for the next hour to 2 hours. But yeah, no, I'm getting over that pancake slump, and yeah, ready to get into the headlines.
I've had too much sugar, so expect me to fall apart midway through the episode. Moving on to those headlines, we mentioned last time that we'd lost access to our lovely headline website. Turns out there's a new BBC website, not a BBC website, but a page on the BBC site that gives us the rundown of the papers. And just having a quick look at that, it has a history. That's really good. That's what I like to see. So that's really good. So we're going to put that link in the show notes and in the chat, and you'll be able to follow the headlines with us in the future, which is great. So let's move on into our first headline. So from the New York Times, Trump acquitted of inciting insurrection, even as bipartisan majority votes guilty.
Yeah, this is the news that Donald J. Trump has been sort of acquitted for the second time in his presidency. He will not be impeached formally. In both times, the trial sort of stopped in the Senate, where it is a requirement that if you want to impeach a president, you need at least a 2/3 majority. We've known for like a week or two now that I think the Democrats were always going to fail to pass this hurdle. There were a couple of key votes that happened before the trial even went ahead. One of which was, can you even impeach a president outside of his term, essentially? That was a pretty close vote in the Senate, but it just passed. Once that was sort of decided that the trial could go ahead, but you knew that most of the Republicans weren't up for impeaching the president, you always knew that the Democrats were going to struggle. What I think were the big talking points about this whole impeachment trial in the Senate was how much more detail we got about that insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. There was a lot of eyewitness accounts, a lot of footage, a lot of detail about how the protest, sort of like minute by minute details of how this protest unraveled and ended up going into the House of Representatives in quite shocking detail. Secondly, I think maybe one of the things that stood out for me was just like quite how poor the defense argument was from the Trump side. I don't know, did you see any of the video of that defense lawyer, his opening statement at all? Because that was the thing that grabbed like the headlines first day.
Yeah, I've seen some clips, essentially. I haven't watched it in full. But yes, it seems kind of, I mean, my kind of overview of it was the Democrats have come ahead and been like, here's a load of information you didn't know about, like how close they got to certain senators, things like that, which it should be really worrying to the American public and make them really take stock. And almost like their strategy was to try and, maybe worrying they won't win the impeachment, but, try and win the popular understanding of what happened that day by sharing all these details, which will be televised to the nation. And then the Republican guy kind of stood up and went like, I mean, so we had like, it's kind of weird because the defense lawyer for Trump was like, oh no, this is all like rubbish, trying to throw it out. And then you had the counterpoint of Mitch McConnell, who kind of said, yes, he totally did all these terrible things. We just can't impeach him. And like, it was really different speeches. Like, it was very strange.
Yeah, and it was just, I found that it was kind of typical Trump, wasn't it? He'd struggled to get a lawyer to represent him even, and then the one he picked didn't seem to be an expert in constitutional law. And their arguments weren't necessarily that Donald Trump didn't incite this violence. It was more along the lines of, oh, you can't actually impeach him at this time. This is unconstitutional. In the end, like I said, it was going to be a big battle for Democrats. And although they did fall short of the 67 votes needed to convict, I think what was significant is they got at least 7 Republicans to cross the floor and vote guilty, which is historically the most amount of senators from a president's party to vote against them in all impeachments that have happened throughout US history. It kind of shows that Donald Trump is still quite a divisive factor in the Republican Party, even though a lot say that they clearly want to back him. I think the most frustrating thing for me was, so you've got Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate leader. He came out and said, actually, I do think that Trump probably did incite those people, but I couldn't vote guilty because he's not president anymore. And if we'd done this while he was president, yeah, I would have happily voted guilty. But gosh darn it, we had to do it afterwards. To which I kind of say Mitch McConnell was one of the leading forces in the Republican Party to make sure that this vote happened after Donald Trump was out of office. There was a huge kind of like, it'll be super divisive. You might incite more riots if you impeach him before he goes out. So I felt like Mitch McConnell you can't have it both ways. Like, if you did think he was guilty, then you should have pushed for the trial to happen when you said it was legal to get him out.
It's very Mitch McConnell, right? We've seen, I know we previously spoke about the Supreme Court decisions that he's been involved in. So pushing back at the end of Obama's term so that the Democrats couldn't get another Supreme Court justice in place, and then completely doing the opposite thing at the end of Trump's term when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. So, this is exactly how he works. But, it seems very transparent. But if the right clips are getting out there to the public, actually, this is the thing, like, for people following it, you can see what he's doing. But if you're just the average person in the public who sees the sound bites on the news, you probably get the impression that he's always on the right side, if you see what I mean, which I think is what he's trying to portray. It doesn't take long to realize that he is playing both sides in all these arguments very shrewdly. But I think the average person just seeing a few sound bites might be like, oh, okay, I agree with that. Oh, I agree with that. And like, without not putting two and two together, they're like 2 weeks apart and it's his fault.
Yeah, very much so. I think this just I think this is the last thing. I was joking with my wife earlier about this podcast that we've got 3 topics at the moment: Trump, Brexit, and coronavirus. And trust me, those other 2 are coming up, don't you worry. But I feel that this is sort of the thing that draws the line under the Trump presidency definitively. I'm hoping it'll be the last bit of big Trump news I have to talk about in the next 2 to 4 years, fingers crossed that he doesn't run again or anything, but it draws a line under it. And I think it was really weird that there were some reports that Trump was sort of frustrated with the defense and how they performed, but we never got that insight into his soul or what he was thinking because he's not on Twitter anymore. He wasn't able to rant and rave like he usually does, which was kind of nice, actually. It meant that this was able to go a lot more smoothly or without apparent outside influence. So, yeah, although he wasn't impeached, I think it's fair to say that this was definitely not although some members of the Trump family were claiming it as a victory. I know that Donald Trump Jr. tweeted the phrase 2-0. It's probably like it's the one thing
he doesn't even like football.
Exactly. It's the one thing you shouldn't brag about. It's a very odd thing to happen. But yeah, fingers crossed this will be the last time I mention Donald J. Trump on this podcast.
What a suggestion that we won't have to talk about Trump again. I imagine we will be completely wrong by next time. He'll do something ridiculous, I'm sure. So moving on through our 3 topics, we're on to COVID next. So from the Metro, 15,062,189 reasons to cheer.
This is about the sort of vaccine success that's going on in the UK. There's not much to be happy about with coronavirus in general, but it does seem that the UK seems to be leading the charge in getting a lot of their citizens vaccinated, with up to 15 million done now by mid-February, which, considering the first doses of the vaccine were administered in early December, I don't think that's bad for 3 months. Also, considering
it seems to be going pretty well. That's approximately 23% of the population. I know we're going to go into this a bit more, but it seems really good, right?
Well, yeah, no, it just seems massive to me. Are there loads of old people I didn't know about that make up that percentage of the population? Obviously there are, but it's just because obviously they're prioritizing not only hospitals, but the elderly, the over 90s, the over 80s. I don't know where they are in their chain of who they get to vaccinate. But it just seemed like a really high percentage for me, where I was like, oh, I don't know that many friends who have been vaccinated. Clearly they are doing the majority of the elderly population.
Yeah, having just Googled it because I was intrigued, there are 1.4 million staff in the NHS. So the NHS only represents a 20th of that overall number of people, assuming everyone in the NHS was vaccinated. So it's going to be a lot of care homes. Obviously, there are some vulnerable people who've already received the vaccine. But in general, I think my impression of it, I mean, obviously, we had a slightly different experience because we got it as staff at hospitals. But the thing I found kind of interesting is how many people I know have started to get it who aren't NHS related. So and I think today it was announced there's a further 4 million people have been put onto the kind of shielding group and therefore can get the vaccine. So I think that group is a lot larger than people might suspect when they hear about shielding. Like we have a few friends our age who, for various health reasons, are. But there are so many reasons you can be on that list that actually I think that's probably where a lot of that's coming from. Admittedly, we do have quite an old population. I don't have the demographics of the UK in front of me. But yeah, it's a big number. It's a good number. I'm glad that one thing has been working. Funny how when you give something over to the organization that's designed to do it, it actually works as opposed to getting your mates to do it.
Yes. Yeah, that would be... I know lots of comparisons have been made with the apparent non-success of Test and Trace. 22 billion or something was the figure that I read, which is double the amount that we were giving the EU. And, which ones had more benefit, you decide. But still, there is lots of discussions to have about private contracts. I haven't gone into depth with it in this episode, but I know it's something that Channel 4 was doing some excellent reporting on earlier this week, and I think it's likely to be one of Keir Starmer's biggest attack lines when it comes to how the government has been dealing with this, the amount of public money that's gone to private organisations and their relative success that they've had with what they've been given to deal with. There's a discussion to be had there about has that money been spent wisely, but like you said, if this vaccination program that seems to be happening entirely through the NHS appears to be going incredibly well, and yeah, it's just one of those. It's a rare COVID good news story, and I think it's really good that it's making headlines here.
So in more COVID news, from The Times, travellers may face 10 years in jail for lies about travel.
Yeah, this was kind of like the stark news that the government was planning to jail people for up to 10 years if they lied about where they come in from. For example, if they come in from one of the banned places, not like banned places, but South Africa, for example, has its own variant that would be on a COVID watch list, which means that you've got to be truthful about where you've been, so when you come back, you can quarantine responsibly. It turned out that a lot of people haven't been honest with those answers, and of course, that puts people at risk if you do that. So the government seemed to be getting very tough by saying 10 years in jail. For lying about that travel. Now, to me, that does seem incredibly strict. Like, there are sentences for much worse crimes where you can get a far lower sentence as standard. And I think even Labour leader Keir Starmer, who clearly has a background in law, said that he could sort of like sniff like a headline figure for that when it's not. It's clearly a scare tactic. It's unlikely that the government will ever actually enforce or lock anybody away for 10 years. And things being as they are, I don't think I've heard of a single person getting to court and having that sentence imposed on them. If the day comes when they do, I think it will be quite shocking for people. But it does seem to be more a case of the government trying to deter people, but they might not actually enforce it to that severity. I don't know what you'd have to do to get 10 years for lying that you'd been to Portugal, unless you came home and coughed over everyone deliberately. It's just slightly bizarre. So yeah, that's one way that the government has been trying to deal or trying to put people off being dishonest about their holiday plans. But to me, it seems like a little bit of overkill, or somebody has gone for the headline figure rather than thinking of the actual practical application of that law.
I don't think I have much more to add on that one. It's just, yeah, sometimes there's a lot of things about perverse incentives in economics that can apply to these things. Like sometimes you kind of have to have a ridiculous sounding thing to stop people. But obviously, many jokes have already been made about the people. They're in jail. Or what are you in for? Oh, I said I had to go to Magaluf for essential purposes. That kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah. It seems absurd, but the idea is to put people off, right? And I'm sure some people will still do it. And the thing is also how they, like in a lot of cases, I imagine it'll be hard to prove. It's just one of those things where it might not have as much, it sounds impressive, but actually it has no teeth often. We've been finding throughout this entire crisis. So moving on, from the Sunday Express, and I think I have to do this appropriately. Give me a second to prepare myself. this must be the final lockdown. I think that's how they intended us to read it, right?
Definitely, yeah. I think historically, Sunday Express, big fans of Europe. Definitely how they intended that. I think there's been a lot of talk about this recently, about rumblings that, we're in a lockdown currently. We're not going to see a way out of this lockdown until March at the earliest. I think that's when the government has said that pupils are going to start going back to school. And a lot of people generally getting fed up with the whole concept of lockdown. So they're kind of looking to the Prime Minister to say, look, vaccinations are on the up. If we vaccinate the entire population, will this be the final lockdown that we will impose? I was musing on this earlier, and I think one of the reasons people are so fed up with lockdown are the first one, we talked about this a little bit before, but the first one was kind of like 6 weeks, 8 weeks.
We were all in it together.
We were all in it together. We got out. We had a summer where we could go outside and it was nice and sunny, etc., etc.
It very much felt, it's amazing to look back on that now and how much it felt like things were opening up in the summer. We had our understanding of how things were going to work. And, that is such a different feeling to how we suddenly felt when we went back into that second one.
Yeah. And I think it's going back into that second one. Part of me feels that second one happened at the start of November, right? And that was the lockdown to save Christmas. Or that's how it was marketed anyway. And then we came out of that early December and straight into a tier system. Now, I don't know what tier you were in where you live, but it must have been like tier 3, tier 2.
We were 2 and then we got moved up to 3. We didn't spend very long at 2 in the end.
Yeah, precisely.
Like we were in 2 long enough for plans to be made, but not enacted upon to meet up with people following the guidelines.
Yeah. So you went from tier 2 into tier 3. For some people in areas like the Midlands or the Northeast, they went out of lockdown straight into tier 3, which some people have already described tier 3 as being a kind of lockdown anyway, with how much meeting people is restricted, etc., etc. Then as it was coming up to Christmas, I think the tiers around us got ramped up, and then we were obviously Christmas plans were cut from 7 days to 1 day, and we were announced that we were going into another national lockdown in January. So kind of from, particularly if you've been living in London, which I think was under tier 4 over Christmas towards the end, you've kind of been in a perpetual lockdown since November in some way, shape or form. And I can totally see how, if it's gone on for that long, like a quarter of a year, with a lot of those restrictions in place, that's way more restrictive than what we had in the summer, for example, that people are starting to get fed up of it. Clearly it's needed. Clearly we need to get the R rate down. And of course we had that massive spike over December, which proved that, a lockdown was the only way to deal with this. And it might be that those lockdowns have had to be extended because of the new variants of COVID that have come out that seem to be even more infectious and keep the R rate high. But still, I do think that has affected the general mood in the country and a general feeling of, I really quite like this lockdown to end. If it was all safe, yes, please, I'd really like it to end. And not many people are looking forward to the prospect of another one happening. So Boris Johnson has been pushed on this. He says he would like it to be the final lockdown, but in true Boris fashion was unwilling to commit. I think that's probably a fairly sensible move for him. You can't look into the future. You don't know where outbreaks are going to be. And, I don't think anybody could have predicted the variants that happened in December and the need for a more extended lockdown. I think we all could have maybe predicted that infections were going to go up over the winter period, and stress on the NHS would be quite big over the winter period, as it always is. But yeah, I think this push for a final lockdown, I can totally see where people are coming from, but I think it does have to be balanced with this kind of caution and the fact that lockdowns do work. They've been proven to get the R rate down. And if we are in the situation where the infection rate is going up and hospitals are under stress again, I think lockdown is again the only way out of it. I don't think you can sort of like push on through it. I don't know of a single place in the world that's followed that same strategy and seen it working. So I just wanted to touch on that. That appears to be a mood that is coming up, particularly amongst a lot of backbench Tory MPs as well, who are kind of wanting to have Boris Johnson sign his name against something to say this will be the final lockdown. But yeah, I don't see it happening. I don't see the government making that kind of concrete prediction when as with everything with this virus, it's so unpredictable in the first place.
Yeah. One thing I want to add on that is that I've been avidly following the estimated infection level in the Zoe app, which I think you may be aware of. It's the COVID-19 app where you self-report when you feel like you have symptoms in the. I mean, it's been used for all sorts of useful things, including like working out the fact that the loss of smell is an important symptom. And I was avidly following it as I watched us coming out of 2 weeks since we went into this new lockdown. It was coming down, and 2 days ago we got down to the level we were at after that second lockdown, and I was like, this is great. And so it's sad that I am to report that it started rising again, and I don't know what happened 2 weeks ago. Like, I don't know if maybe it was a snow day or something, but it seems like there was a pickup, but I can't draw to my mind anything that changed about my life 2 weeks ago. I was in lockdown and I stayed in lockdown, so it's interesting to see. So hopefully that is a momentary blip and it continues to go down. But yeah, I was hoping to be able to say, oh, look, it's looking really good. But now with 2 days after that lowest point in a while, it seems like it's going back up again, which is slightly concerning. Sorry, that's a bit of a downer.
No.
Let's move on to the main story, which I'm sure will make everyone very happy. So on into our main story tonight, Brexit 1 month on. So where are we? I know we talked about this when we were talking about the inauguration and all those other things that we did want to kind of touch on Brexit a bit. We did have some headlines, but I think it's time we had a proper deep dive into what it's like. I mean, the world didn't entirely collapse when we left the EU, did it? But I think we've had some teething problems.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to look over a number of factors that now we've had a month out of it. I think the government can't just say, oh, this was just a blip or this is very short term. We can have more of this appears to be a trend and it's going this way when it comes to Brexit. We've had a couple of disputes with the EU, etc., etc. So I thought it was just worth going into a bit more detail with those. So yeah, if you want to kick us off with our first factor.
Of course. I mean, so we've already talked about it a bit with people having their illicit ham sandwiches taken off them as they approached the border, lest they be taken into the EU, and also lots of form filling for various lorry drivers. So how are the borders faring, and how's this trade going on at the border? Without the excitement of the vaccine stuff going on from the EU, what is there to talk about now the dust has settled a little?
So the big figure that came out in one of the Sunday papers from The Observer was that the volume of exports going through British ports to the EU fell by 68% last month compared with January last year, which The Observer has attributed to problems caused by Brexit. So essentially they are saying that there are lots of goods still being held up, or that the demand has gone down as a result of Brexit, and clearly we've talked about a lot of paperwork, etc., that was holding up vital goods and services. They're also saying that a lot of those lorries that are coming in from, although lorry traffic is, the government has claimed that lorry traffic is relatively the same compared with last year. It's about the number of goods exchanging hands. So a lot of lorries might be going from the UK into the EU fully loaded, but when they come back, they're empty. And maybe in the past, they would have been used for another trip to bring goods back into the UK. So that clearly shows a massive fall. Like 68% is 2/3. That's a hell of a lot. I think one thing where these figures are slightly misleading is you've got to remember that the pandemic has affected the entire world and how much is being spent, for example. So it is also likely that there will be less trade over the border because of effects of COVID. And we've kind of mentioned this before when we've been talking headlines. The effect of COVID and the economic impact that's having, I think, is clearly masking some of the bigger impacts that Brexit would be having if we were in a normal, I'm doing bunny ears around the microphone, but you can't see it.
I can imagine them, Rob.
If you're doing it in a normal situation. But yeah, I think that headline figure, that 68% fall off in exports, is huge. And when the government kind of said that this would be a big boost for trade and borders, and the fact that that isn't happening, at least in the short term, I think that reflects that is a figure that we will have to continue to monitor as Brexit continues, particularly if we do start to see an upturn in the economy and vaccination proves successful and we can get out of lockdown, etc., businesses start opening up. I'd like to see those comparisons in months going forward. Clearly, this is the first month and it could just be a blip, but it's not a great place for Brexit to start with that big headline figure.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good to be looking at, say, April, I imagine, would help give us a clearer picture, because that's after, like, that was the first lockdown, so I suppose that's the worst it was from that point of view, I would imagine.
That's a very good
when everyone
point.
was stuck at home.
Yeah.
So if we compare that directly, then we might be able to try and tease out what percentage is down to Brexit compared to the pandemic. But we'll have to wait and see. With that, I suppose. So next up, we have discussed this a little bit already on this show. Food, mostly fish. I know we talked about it before the deal was signed, how there was all this attention being paid to fish. But I feel, despite all the attention being paid to fish, it hasn't really worked out from the government's point of view, having been protested already by all the various fishermen's unions with their lorries.
Yeah, not at all. And the fact that the government has had to set up a £23 million fund to try and help compensate fishing firms, it kind of shows where we are as a country with how we think this deal has affected some industries, most clearly fish, but also, other, we talked about those cheese sandwiches being taken from lorry drivers. It's those kind of products, the meat, the dairy going through, they appear to have been slowed down in their transit by the huge amount of paperwork that is required to get those products in and out of the EU. I think I just wanted to highlight not only the fact that, that food is going off, clearly it's time sensitive, which means that it's very frustrating for people to have to deal with a lot of paperwork to get that through borders. But one of the big selling points was always about Brexit, that it would cut EU red tape. Like, there was a lot made of, we follow these bizarre EU rules and regulations. If we get out of this group, we'll be able to make our own rules and stop the bureaucracy. That might be true internally, but when it comes to trading with the EU, guess what? It turns out that regulatory alignment was actually really super useful for a really quick exchange of goods and services. Hey, who knew? So
it's almost like a single market designed entirely around the idea of trading goods and services. It's good for such a thing.
Yeah, who can say? Who can say for certain? But
not us, clearly.
clearly. But that is, there is a BBC article where it was like something like 71 pages for fish to get something through. It does seem like a ridiculous amount for that kind of basic trade to happen, and it's clear why that would put off some firms, particularly smaller firms, getting their goods and services to trade with the EU. So that's one of the big impacts that we've seen in the short term. It might be that continued negotiation with the EU about those factors will help to reduce the time that food is taken through. And clearly a lot of this is off the back of a deal which we said at the time was like maybe rushed, or hey, usually these trade deals take 7 years to get through, not the 2 that we had, or the very condensed time period that it took in the end to get something through before that final deadline. These problems may be ironed out, but it's certainly, I think it's true that in the short term, the deal that Boris Johnson was able to negotiate at the end of last year clearly is having a big impact on those meat, dairy, fish industries that are trying to get their goods to the EU.
Yeah, and it's I know we touched a bit on the bureaucracy there, but it'll be interesting to see, like, any change in bureaucracy is going to cause problems. And from the articles I've read, it seems like there were some misunderstandings going around, and you would imagine that as companies get used to dealing with it, and yes, there's more friction, but you would expect the negative impact of that bureaucracy to come down over time. But the question is, how much is the cost? Because I saw some stories saying that you now have to hire, you basically need someone to just do the admin for one of these companies, which means finding another employee. And so that's obviously an additional cost and an entire employee's worth of time to handle all that bureaucracy.
Yeah, and it depends on, and then that reflects on the size of your business, right? If you're a relatively large business, you probably could afford to employ those extra people. If you're a small person who was just getting by before, and have been promised that Brexit was going to be a boon to your industry, and actually in the short term it's a drain, then that's clearly going to cause lots of issues. And that's why we've seen the government set up those funds, I think, to try and get the fishing industry through this, what the government would hope is a short-term problem. We'll have to see again. It's one of those ones where compare it in April, compare it in 6 months, but clearly what's happened in the first month clearly hasn't been good. I don't think anybody in the fishing industry would turn around at this moment and say, hey, this has been a great deal for us.
No, definitely not. No. So next up, more border and kind of related woes, I suppose. I mean, it all is. I mean, essentially, we've created a border. That's the problem. But online shopping, or I suppose any shopping, it doesn't need to be online. You could do it over the phone, though I imagine most people are doing it online. You're now getting charged VAT on goods coming in from the EU.
Yeah. So, like, previously, before Brexit, you would have paid VAT at a rate charged by the country you bought the item from. And more importantly to you, you may have seen that when you clicked on that thing when you bought it at point of purchase. So it was very clear how much you were spending, and when they came to you, no problem. What's happening with a lot of firms now is that VAT is being added after the fact, particularly for any item over £135, which means that there can be up to 20%. There can be up to a 20% charge when that package arrives at your door. So you might have ordered something, it comes up to a delivery driver. Oh yeah, by the way, you've got to pay the VAT on that. That's an extra £80 on the thing you've already paid £200+ on, or whatever it is. And there have been newspaper reports of people essentially like refusing to pay the money, and the delivery driver then driving off with that item because they can't legally give it to you. This is clearly causing a lot of problems, not only for personal consumers, but again, small businesses who may have been caught out by this charge or not prepared to pay the extra as a result of Brexit. So I think it's just one of those smaller things that particularly, clearly I can see why the government wasn't advertising this fact as one of the benefits of Brexit, because clearly it's going to make things more complicated. But I think it is one of those things that would have caught out a lot of people in the short term. And if your accounts weren't adjusted to, accept this change in VAT or how it's applied, or where you're going to get I've always got suppliers in Europe who gave me this thing, now I might have to find a new supplier if I want to stay in business, etc., etc. It complicates things. So once again, I think that is another thing that's been around kind of like negative, particularly for small businesses that have had to deal with these unexpected charges in January.
Yeah, so I mean, this is definitely one of those stories where there's a lot of anecdata going around. I don't know anyone who runs a small business that's been directly affected by this. You see a lot of stories going around. I know there was a story of a bike shop that's not shipping to the UK anymore because of the fees, and there's other things going on. It's interesting because actually it's not just the EU who are now having this. So the idea is to basically save us time processing customs stuff. So VAT is now supposed to be charged ahead of time by everyone. So it's not just the EU, but it actually is affecting also stuff coming in from the US and other products. It's just a general change to how VAT is handled by the UK. And that's interesting because there are a few podcasts I follow about very kind of specific topics, like buying fountain pens and things like that, where lots of people buy stuff from the US and import them. And it turns out actually the US, despite you think, the US, they're going to be really confused by this because they have a completely different tax system and what's this? But actually, because they already have different taxes for every state, which makes sense when you think about it, but is also kind of mind-boggling. So, like paying a different tax rate in Surrey compared to Shropshire. That because they already do that, a lot of US websites have said, this is really easy to do. It's the same system. We just know that your rate is 20% as opposed to other places might be 11.5 or whatever. At least we don't have a weird percentage like some states do. So that's an interesting kind of part of it where this is kind of an overall change, but it does kind of feel like we're trying to offshore the handling of this bureaucracy and just be like, just pay it in advance, sort it out for us. And obviously, as we said before with the previous point about food as well, it's those smaller businesses where they can't necessarily employ someone to do the overhead. I mean, if you're on the right kind of payment platform already, there's probably a built-in way of handling it that can just be rolled out. But if you're not using that, if you're a smaller business, maybe you're just accepting PayPal or something like that. I don't know which companies have already implemented fixes, but that's where the problems are going to lie. And it's definitely affecting certain things. I mean, I also have a hobby of board games, and that's something where people would buy a lot of board games across from the EU. You might play the roulette of if the euro is at the right point, then you can get a game a lot cheaper by importing it. And so obviously stuff like that has changed. The thing is, what kind of so many things in the economy are interlinked. It's really hard to see what effect that's happening at this stage.
Yeah, totally. It's one of those things that will balance out. Maybe it's just that shock of, I didn't know this was coming in. I think it is particularly shocking for people who have stuff arrive at their door and like, I've got to pay more, like where that fee hasn't been applied in advance. That's a massive shock. But I think you're right. If it's just applied generally for everyone, like also of US goods, etc., then hey, it might just be something we get used to, but it's on top of everything else. It just seems like it's added extra confusion into the mix.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, any extra confusion, any extra friction, I think that's what it is. It's all these little things, and they're building up and up. and then you end up with a whole problem, because it's fine if you have a little bit of friction somewhere maybe, but if there's friction all over the economy, suddenly you can start to have a slowdown. I mean, and that's on top of what's happening from coronavirus right now, as we say, which is masking things somewhat. So the other thing, I believe we've had an effect with financial services, because there was a big discussion about what would be agreed with the EU with regards to financial services just before the deal was signed. And so my understanding is that some businesses are going over to Amsterdam, and Amsterdam is lapping up business that we previously had.
Yeah, so basically financial services and how they were managed wasn't dealt with in the Brexit deal at all. It was kind of said, we can do our own thing. But it's clear that investors have been like making their money talk and moving more of their trading of shares from London into Amsterdam and other EU locations. There's quite a good graph in that link that I've sent you that shows how much this has changed between December and January of this year. So in December, you had Amsterdam doing about 2 billion worth of shares and London doing over 14 billion. Now in January, Amsterdam are doing closer to 9 billion in shares and we're about 8.5 billion. So that it shows like quite a dramatic rise for people moving to Amsterdam and seeing how many people are taking their trade there. It does appear that, at least in financial circles, there does seem to be some impact of Brexit and how people manage their money or where they want their money to move through. Now, again, as with all of these things that we've discussed, it might just be a short-term effect. That's just 1 month. And, if Britain can get its act together, or if investors get less jumpy about the impact of Brexit, they may decide to move back to London as their traditional place to trade shares. However, it's clearly it's clear that lots of investors have changed their mind about where they want to do business, and we've already discussed in previous podcasts how it was official advice from civil servants that actually it would be easier for businesses in the UK to do deals with the EU if they had some business presence within the EU in the first place. So, yeah, I think, again, it was one of those things that was touted as a big boom, that Britain might be able to become the Singapore of Europe. Like, we can have a special set of economic rules that being out of the EU allows us to have, and therefore investors will flock to us. In the short term, that certainly doesn't seem to be the case, and the financial sector is one of the biggest employers in London. It's seen as like one of the crown jewels, I think, of how of Britain's economy and how it's able to run and how it's got certain specialisms in that area. So if we were to lose that as a result of Brexit, I don't think many Brexiteers would certainly be disappointed that had been one of the unintended consequences. Again, yeah, like we've got to wait and see, but the data at the moment doesn't look great for the financial sector.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning. I know that the Economist podcast went in depth on this a bit more than we will be able to, but they were pointing out, this is one thing, as you say, like this could be like a fluctuation in the market, and you see next month that suddenly it's more normal. But there's still lots of brick and mortar banks and things in London, and those haven't gone anywhere as of yet. So it's not. I don't think necessarily people are super concerned right now that this is a death knell for the financial industry in London. It's bound to continue. It always has been a big finance centre, but we do now lose that easy access into the European financial market that we had before. So it would not be surprising over a number of years for the impact of London in that sphere to decrease. And so on to our final topic in this story, Northern Ireland and medicines. So I know we've touched on this in a previous episode and we touched on it earlier. There was quite the row between the EU and AstraZeneca, actually, and Northern Ireland got pulled into the fray.
Yeah, so I think it's worth pointing out that in general, like some of our concerns that we had about Brexit, that key medicines wouldn't be able to cross in between the EU and the UK and that might affect treatment, that hasn't come to fruition. So I think that's good. That's good that the deal was able to make sure that people's health wasn't adversely affected. But in kind of another twist of events, when you're talking about medicines, there's been a big row between the EU and AstraZeneca, which is the supplier of the Oxford vaccine, and how much supply that the EU is going to get. So clearly the UK has been very successful in vaccinating its population so far. And even though, I think it's the Pfizer vaccine being used to vaccinate NHS staff, or at least that's the one I know I got. I don't know if you got the same. And if you
No, I did end up getting the Pfizer one because I was expecting to get the AstraZeneca one because we believed it was based on which hospital you were being vaccinated at. But then it seems like there was an issue with AstraZeneca supply on that particular day. And that's normal. Like, they basically said you get whatever you get when you turn up. So it's not surprising. But yes, I did get the Pfizer one in the end. One of our friends has ended up getting the AstraZeneca one. So I know we know a few people who have had both. Or sorry, not both. We know a few people who've had different ones.
Yeah. So the AstraZeneca one, which is the Oxford one, the EU put in a big bulk order, and so did the UK. And the EU's order, unsurprisingly, is larger than the amount that the UK paid for it. And because they were able to buy in bulk more, they basically get a better price per vaccine than the UK did. However, because the UK placed their order first, they're sort of the front of the queue for receiving the vaccines that they ordered. And it turns out that AstraZeneca has had essentially a supply problem or a production problem getting as many produced as possible. And it turned out there'd be quite a big shortfall in the amount of vaccines they'd be able to supply the EU with. This caused a massive row between the two, and essentially the turn of events basically meant that the EU decided they might invoke Article 16 of the Brexit Protocol to try and restrict trade with Northern Ireland, which is kind of it's a very nuclear option to do that because
at the time we were talking about it as being this, absolutely last resort option. People were saying it shouldn't be in there, but it was absolutely a last resort. And then within a few weeks of us leaving the EU, it suddenly gets trotted out. And I mean, I know this is going to be your main point in the next section, but I mean, what a bad look.
Yeah, precisely. Like, it was, it's weird to, we're a fairly Remain-focused podcast. We thought that maybe it would be the UK who might bring out this as a negotiating weapon at some point. But the fact that the button was pressed so early and so readily by the EU, it was quite worrying, and certainly is quite like a bad look for the EU and the leadership of them, in general. Because the whole point of Article 16 was to make sure that there would be a smooth transition of goods and services it'd be a smooth move of goods that continue to operate under EU customs rules. And that was put in place because you have a very sensitive border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and you want to avoid a hard border. That's why it's in place. So to have the EU trigger that, which might enforce a hard border, which then creates all types of other problems for Northern Ireland, it was worrying. Now, the fact of the matter was that they kind of threatened it, and they threatened it and said, right, we're going to do it, but nobody on their ground actually enforced those rules. And by the time the EU had basically said, we'll pull it back, we're very, very sorry that we've pushed this button, no trade had been affected. So the button was never really pushed in an actual physical sense. There was no actual impact on Northern Ireland, as it turned out. But the fact that the EU was so readily willing to consider it was concerning, and might show that there are certainly frosty relationships between the EU and the UK, and that's only likely to continue, with Northern Ireland being at the heart of this matter. I mean, Northern Ireland is already the area that I think has been affected most by the previous 5 things we've talked about. We've said that they've had trouble importing food at a level that's greater than what we've had in the UK. Like, you can't have Percy Pig sweets in Northern Ireland Marks and Spencers, for example, because they're banned for some reason. It's too complicated to get them in. I've heard stories of people who have got dogs and travel regularly between Northern Ireland and the UK. They've had a real trouble getting pet passports or whatever it is that you require to move dogs in and out of there. Their regulatory, the things they need, if you think there are problems with bureaucracy at our border between the UK and the EU, normally their border seems to be having even more problems. So in what already is quite a delicate situation, the EU certainly made it worse by invoking Article 16, and it's a worrying benchmark for what might happen in the future between those nations. And kind of if Brexit is going to work, I know that the country as a whole has taken, this government as a whole has taken quite a hard Brexity approach. But but they do have to keep working with the EU for it to work. If they both go completely isolationist, then that will have an even more negative impact on both countries. So fingers crossed that this was just a flash in the pan, and that no other action is taken. But I certainly do think that it was the EU who came off looking worse out of that in general, and the commissioner, the leader at the moment, does have some serious questions to answer about what they're going to do in future and how they're going to make up for that fall in vaccines. I think most likely, I think I saw reported today when I was researching this story, it looks like the EU are going to go to Moderna to backfill the vaccines that they would have lost from the AstraZeneca contract, which means that, hey, like, I guess it's the Oxford vaccine. So if the Oxford vaccine doesn't, if they don't fulfill their orders, or, the EU takes some of their money away because they're not fulfilling that order, then maybe that has some impact on the UK in some way. But going to another supplier probably should the EU's first move rather than threatening peace in Northern Ireland. Just saying.
Definitely, and I mean, it was such a top of the list item. During all those negotiations, we kept mentioning it. We were like, you can't mess up the Northern Ireland peace process. All of this, but by doing this, and then. And also, I think, the two most shocking things, one, that they did this in the first place, very much getting off on the wrong foot. The fact that they didn't tell one of their own member states about it seems also very worrying. It does sound like it was like a bureaucratic slip-up, but it is definitely, the wrong foot forwards so early on into this new relationship. Although I think one thing we should take away from it is, like, you can't expect the EU to play nice with us necessarily. Just, they will follow the rules that we have. But, the EU will look out for the EU. Like, this is what we said, before all this happened. In general terms, we just didn't realize it would be so specific and so early on that something like this might almost happen. Yeah,
it's like the fact it's taken 1 month for this to happen is like, oh no, like maybe we should be friends again, like, or at least get off on a better foot, because that's not the way to start a functioning relationship outside when we're outside of the EU.
So I don't think we have any particular polls we wanted to look at this week. I know we mentioned last time that if there's a poll that catches your eye, please send it our way. But we haven't got anything in the show notes for this week. You can, of course, email us ideas for polls, interesting polls you've found, at unparliamentary@tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com. But I think, other than that, I think it's our usual outro. So thank you, as always, for listening to us talk about politics. Thank you, as always, Rob, for joining me and filling me in on the various political things I wasn't necessarily aware of. And you can find us in all of the places. If you go to parliamentary.observer on our website, you will find the show. You'll find links to everything. You can go from there to Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, all these other places. Instagram, where we sometimes post little clips, or sometimes I just post myself reading Private Eye. And of course, you can find us on all of the various podcast apps. If you like this episode, do share it with a friend. Tell people why you like us and why they should subscribe, because the best thing is just having more listeners. And of course, if you can afford to and want to support what we're doing here at TTSS Productions, go to patreon.com/TTSS. And after all of that, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.